The first thing I saw that morning was not the missing gate. It was the empty space where my family's history had stood for more than 20 years. My name is Daniel Whitmore, and I never imagined a neighborhood association would decide it had the power to change my property without asking. But when I drove toward my barn that morning, I immediately knew something was wrong. The heavy wooden gates that protected the entrance to my livestock area were gone. The posts were still there, the ground showed signs that someone had worked around them, and a small notice from the HOA was attached nearby explaining that the removal was part of a community appearance improvement project. At first, I thought there had been a misunderstanding. I contacted the HOA president, Victoria Reynolds, expecting a simple conversation. Instead, she calmly explained that the gates created a visual barrier between the neighborhood golf course and the surrounding landscape. According to her, the change would improve the view for residents and visitors. What she did not mention was the most important question. Who gave her permission to remove something that belonged on my property? I asked for the approval documents, the survey information, and any written agreement showing the HOA had authority over my barn area. Victoria assured me everything had been handled properly, but her answers became less specific when I requested the details in writing. That was the moment I stopped treating it like a simple neighborhood disagreement. I went back to my office and opened the original property records I had kept since purchasing the land. The documents showed something the HOA seemed to ignore. My farm existed before the golf course, before the neighborhood streets, and before the community association was ever created. The barn, the gates, and the surrounding land were part of a private agricultural property with clearly defined boundaries. Then I found something even more interesting. The original county map showed a narrow access area between my property and the golf course, but it also clearly marked the barn entrance as belonging to my land. The HOA had not misunderstood the boundary. They had a map that showed exactly where the line was. I called my attorney, Benjamin Foster, and sent him copies of everything. His first question was simple. Did they remove the gates because they believed they had permission, or because they wanted you to believe they had permission? That question stayed with me because it changed the way I viewed the entire situation. This was no longer about a gate. It was about whether someone could make decisions on private property just because they believed their position gave them control. The timing made everything more complicated. The annual HOA Golf Championship was only days away, and Victoria had already announced a major neighborhood showcase event designed to attract visitors and highlight the community's perfect image. Now I understood why the gates had disappeared so suddenly. But before I could decide my next move, Benjamin found one more detail in the records that changed everything. The HOA had not only known about my property boundaries. They had signed a document years earlier acknowledging them. The document on my desk changed the entire situation. Until that moment, I believed the HOA had made a careless decision. After reading the agreement they signed years earlier, I realized they had known exactly where my property line was all along. The next morning, I met Benjamin Foster at his office with every record I had collected. He placed the original county map, the property survey, and the development agreement across the table. The document was clear. When the neighborhood was created, the developer and the future HOA acknowledged that my farm was an existing agricultural property with its own protected boundaries. The HOA was not responsible for managing my land. They were responsible for respecting it. Benjamin explained that the missing gates were not just a physical change. They represented a decision made without proper authority. But before taking any formal action, he wanted to understand why Victoria Reynolds and the HOA board believed they could remove them. We started reviewing years of community documents, meeting notes, and public announcements. That was when we discovered the first hidden detail. The HOA had been discussing my farm long before the gates were removed. Several meeting notes mentioned concerns about how the barn area appeared from the golf course. The language sounded harmless at first. They wanted a cleaner view. They wanted a more consistent neighborhood appearance. But every discussion focused on changing the way my property looked instead of respecting the fact that it was private land. Benjamin found another interesting detail. The annual HOA Golf Championship was approaching, and the event was expected to bring potential buyers, guests, and local attention to the community. Victoria had approved several improvements around the golf course entrance, including landscaping changes near the area facing my farm. Suddenly, the timing made more sense. The gates were not removed because they were unsafe. They were removed because someone believed they affected the image of the neighborhood. I decided to visit the HOA office and request a copy of the authorization they claimed allowed the removal. Victoria met with me but remained confident. She explained that the board believed the changes were necessary for the community. I asked one simple question. Can you show me the document that gives the HOA control over my barn entrance? She paused before answering. She mentioned community guidelines, appearance standards, and board decisions, but she never provided the document. That answer told me more than any explanation could. After leaving the meeting, I returned to my farm and inspected the area where the gates had been removed. Without the barrier, the connection between my property and the nearby open land was completely different. I noticed tracks near the edge of the field that had not been there before. The wildlife patterns around the area had changed because the old barrier was no longer in place. I documented everything with photographs and notes. Then Benjamin called me with information he had discovered in the county archive. He had found an older environmental report connected to the land before the golf course was built. The report mentioned wildlife movement corridors crossing the surrounding area. It was not a problem when the original barriers were intact, but removing them created a completely different situation. Benjamin warned me that the HOA might have created a problem they did not understand. And then he told me the one thing I never expected to hear. A large herd of wild bison had recently been spotted moving closer to the open areas near the golf course. The moment Benjamin mentioned the wild bison, I understood that the missing gates were no longer just a property dispute. They had changed the balance between my land and the surrounding area, and the HOA had created a situation they never expected. I drove back to the farm and carefully inspected the open section where the barn gates used to stand. I did not make assumptions. I documented everything. I photographed the altered entrance, recorded the condition of the posts, and compared the current layout with the original property records. The more I looked, the clearer it became that the gates were not decorative. They were part of a system designed to manage movement between different areas of the property. Later that afternoon, I contacted the county wildlife office to report what Benjamin had discovered. I wanted to make sure everyone understood the situation before it became a larger issue. The officer I spoke with explained that wild bison movement in the region was unusual but possible, especially when old barriers or natural pathways were changed. He asked me several questions about the location, the surrounding land, and recent changes near my property. When I mentioned that the HOA had removed the gates without my approval, he became more interested. He explained that land changes near wildlife corridors could create unexpected consequences, and records would be important. Meanwhile, Victoria Reynolds was preparing for the annual HOA Golf Championship, which was only 3 days away. The event was supposed to showcase the neighborhood as one of the most desirable communities in the area. Large signs were being installed, landscaping crews were working near the golf course entrance, and residents were preparing for visitors. But behind the scenes, the HOA was dealing with a problem they could not solve with better decorations. The open area created by the removed gates had attracted attention from wildlife officials, and now the upcoming event was under a completely different spotlight. I learned about this when one of the HOA board members contacted me privately. He did not defend the decision to remove the gates. Instead, he admitted that several board members had never seen the original property documents before voting on the project. They had trusted Victoria's interpretation of the situation. That information was important because it revealed something I had not considered. The decision might not have been made by everyone. It may have started with a smaller group that controlled the information presented to the board. Benjamin and I reviewed the new information that evening. He explained that proving someone made a mistake was different from proving someone acted without authority. We needed more than suspicion. We needed records showing what the HOA knew and when they knew it. The next morning, Benjamin found an email chain from the HOA archive that changed the entire situation. The messages were between board members discussing the gate removal weeks before it happened. One sentence stood out immediately. A board member had warned that removing the barriers could create access issues near the open field. But the warning was ignored. Then, at the bottom of the email chain, Victoria had responded with a message that revealed the real priority behind the decision. The gates were not removed because they were a problem. They were removed because they did not match the vision she wanted for the golf course view. And that meant the HOA had knowingly changed my property without understanding the consequences. The email from the HOA archive changed everything because it proved the gate removal was not an accident or a misunderstanding. Someone inside the organization had recognized the possible consequences and decided the appearance of the golf course mattered more than the concerns surrounding my property. I sat with Benjamin Foster reviewing every message carefully, making sure we understood exactly what the documents showed. We were not looking for a dramatic accusation. We were building a timeline based on facts. The emails revealed that several board members had discussed the barn gates before they were removed. One member questioned whether changing the entrance could affect the surrounding land, but the conversation moved forward anyway. Victoria Reynolds continued pushing the project because she believed the old gates made the golf course view less attractive. The most important discovery was not that the HOA wanted a cleaner appearance. It was that they had ignored a warning from their own board member. The annual golf championship was now only 2 days away, and the pressure inside the HOA was increasing. Visitors were expected from across the region, and Victoria had spent months preparing a perfect presentation of the community. But now the attention was moving toward a problem created by her own decision. I received another call from the county wildlife office that morning. They informed me that the bison movement near the golf course had been confirmed, and officials wanted to inspect the area where the old barriers had been removed. They explained that the animals were not the issue by themselves. The concern was that human changes to the landscape had affected a route they had historically used. I agreed to meet with them and provide the property records showing the original layout. When the wildlife officer arrived, he walked the boundary with me and compared the current conditions with older maps. He immediately noticed that the missing gates had changed the connection between my land and the surrounding open space. He asked a simple question. Who authorized this modification? I gave him the HOA documents and the email records. He reviewed them carefully and explained that the decision appeared to have been made without considering the full impact. Meanwhile, Victoria held an emergency HOA meeting that evening. Several residents attended because they had heard about the bison situation and wanted answers. For the first time, some homeowners began questioning whether the board had acted too quickly. Victoria attempted to explain that the HOA was only trying to improve the community, but residents wanted to know why property records and environmental concerns had not been discussed beforehand. One resident asked why the HOA removed something on private land without first contacting the owner. The room became quiet because nobody had a clear answer. After the meeting, Benjamin called me with another update. He had found a development agreement from the original construction phase of the golf course. The agreement contained a section about maintaining separation between community areas and existing agricultural properties. It was the document we had been searching for. It showed that the developer and the early HOA representatives understood the relationship between the neighborhood and my farm from the beginning. But then Benjamin noticed something unusual. The current HOA board had a copy of the same agreement in their records. They had not discovered this information after the dispute started. They already had it before removing the gates. That meant the next question was no longer whether they made a mistake. The question was why they ignored the very document that explained their limits. The development agreement was the document that changed the entire direction of the dispute. For weeks, the HOA had presented the gate removal as a simple improvement project, but the agreement proved something completely different. The organization had inherited rules that clearly separated community responsibilities from private property rights. The problem was not that the HOA did not know the rules. The problem was that they chose to ignore them when those rules became inconvenient. Benjamin Foster and I spent the next morning organizing every piece of evidence into a clear timeline. The property survey showed the boundaries, The development agreement showed the original understanding between the developer and the surrounding landowners. The emails showed that board members discussed the risks before removing the gates. The wildlife report showed that the landscape change had consequences they failed to consider. Each document answered one question while creating another. Why had the HOA been so determined to change my property before the golf championship? As we reviewed the records, Benjamin found another detail hidden inside the meeting notes. The HOA had created a special committee several months earlier called the Community Image Improvement Group. On paper, the committee was responsible for reviewing landscaping, signage, and public appearance around the neighborhood. But the meeting notes showed the group had also discussed properties outside HOA control. My farm was mentioned several times. The committee wanted the golf course view to appear more open and consistent, and the old barn gates were repeatedly described as something that distracted from that goal. That discovery was important because it showed the gate removal was not a last-minute decision. It had been part of a larger plan. Meanwhile, the annual golf championship was getting closer. The HOA continued preparing for the event, but the atmosphere had changed. Residents who once trusted the board were now asking questions. Some homeowners contacted me directly and apologized because they had believed the HOA had proper authority. They admitted they never saw the original property documents and assumed the board had checked everything. I understood their frustration because they had also been given incomplete information. Later that afternoon, the county scheduled a formal review meeting with the HOA, myself, and representatives from the wildlife office. The purpose was not to punish anyone. It was to determine what happened and prevent future problems. Before the meeting, Benjamin gave me one final document he had discovered. It was an internal HOA presentation prepared for the golf championship. The presentation included photos of the course and neighborhood improvements. But on one slide someone had edited the image to reduce the visibility of my farm in the background. It was not a legal violation by itself, but it revealed the mindset behind the decisions. The goal was not just improving the view. The goal was controlling what people saw. At the review meeting, Victoria Reynolds arrived with several board members and a confident explanation ready. She claimed the HOA acted in the best interest of the community. But when officials placed the documents on the table, the conversation changed. The questions were no longer about the appearance of the gates. They were about authority, transparency, and why the HOA ignored agreements they were supposed to follow. Then the wildlife officer presented the final report. He explained that the bison movement near the golf course was connected to changes in the surrounding landscape. The room became silent when he confirmed that the removed gates played a role in changing the existing barrier system. For the first time, Victoria could not simply describe the situation as a neighborhood improvement. The records told a different story. And then Benjamin revealed the final piece of evidence. The person who originally approved the gate removal had signed the authorization without attaching the required property review documents. The HOA had not just overlooked the rules. They had skipped the very process designed to stop this from happening. The review meeting changed the way everyone understood the situation because the facts could no longer be explained away as a simple misunderstanding. For the first time, the HOA board had to answer questions using the same documents they had ignored when making their decision. Benjamin Foster began by placing the property survey, the development agreement, the email records, and the wildlife report in front of the county representatives. He did not make accusations. He simply walked through the timeline and allowed the records to explain what happened. The first issue was the gate removal. The survey showed the barn entrance belonged entirely to my property. The development agreement confirmed that the HOA had acknowledged the boundaries when the neighborhood was created. The email records showed that board members discussed concerns about removing the gates before taking action. The wildlife report then explained how changing the existing barrier system affected the movement patterns in the area. Each piece of evidence connected to the next. Victoria Reynolds tried to explain that the HOA believed it was making a reasonable improvement for the community. She said the board never intended to create problems, and only wanted the golf course area to look more appealing. But the county representative asked a question that changed the tone of the meeting. If the HOA believed the decision was harmless, Why did they ignore the required property review process before making the change? There was no immediate answer. The discussion then moved to the internal authorization documents. Benjamin showed that the approval form used by the HOA did not include the required review attachments. The person who signed it had approved the project without confirming whether the HOA had legal authority over the area. That detail mattered because it showed the decision was not based on complete information. It was based on assumptions. Outside the meeting, several residents gathered to discuss what they had learned. Many admitted they had never seen the original development documents. They believed the HOA handled everything properly because that was what they were told. Some residents were surprised to learn that my farm existed before the golf course and that the community had always been built beside an established agricultural property. The conversation was no longer about whether my farm belonged there. Everyone now understood that it always had. The next morning, county officials returned to my property to review the area where the gates had been removed. They documented the original layout and discussed options for restoring the proper separation between the properties. The wildlife officer explained that the goal was not to blame one side but to correct a situation created by changing the land without fully understanding the consequences. Later that afternoon, Benjamin received a new message from the county attorney. The preliminary review was complete, and the findings were ready. The HOA had exceeded its authority by removing private property structures without permission. The board had failed to follow its own review procedures. The community documents would need to be corrected. But before the official announcement was made, one final issue remained. The county attorney had discovered that the HOA had submitted a different version of the gate project description to residents than the one discussed internally. The public version described a simple appearance upgrade. The internal version mentioned removing visual barriers around the golf course. The difference between those two descriptions revealed the biggest problem of all. The HOA was not just changing the property. They were changing the story about why they changed it. The final review was approaching, but the biggest change was not happening inside the county office. It was happening inside the community itself. For the first time, residents who had trusted the HOA without question began looking deeper into the decisions that affected everyone around them. The documents had revealed something important. The gate removal was not a single mistake made in one afternoon. It was the result of a series of choices where appearance was placed above proper process. Benjamin Foster and I continued preparing for the final county announcement, but we also wanted to understand how many other decisions had been influenced by the same mindset. During the review, county officials requested additional HOA records from the previous years. They examined meeting minutes, project proposals, and communication between board members. What they found was a pattern. The HOA had repeatedly focused on controlling how the neighborhood appeared from public areas, even when those decisions involved properties outside their authority. My farm was not the only subject discussed. Several nearby properties had also been mentioned in conversations about improving the community image. The difference was that my property had clear boundaries and long-standing records that made the issue impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the annual golf championship was still scheduled to begin in a few days. Victoria Reynolds faced a difficult choice. She could continue presenting the original version of events, or she could acknowledge that the HOA had acted without proper authority. According to several residents who attended the board meeting that week, many homeowners wanted honesty more than excuses. They did not want a perfect image created by hiding inconvenient facts. They wanted accurate information about the place they called home. At the next HOA meeting, Victoria addressed the residents. She explained that the board had relied on outdated assumptions and admitted that the property review process should have been followed before any changes were made. It was not a complete admission of every mistake, but it was the first time the HOA publicly recognized that the decision had gone too far. After the meeting, Benjamin told me something important. Winning the argument was not the same as solving the problem. The real solution was making sure the same situation could not happen again. The county required the HOA to update its procedures, create clearer property review requirements, and provide better documentation before taking action involving neighboring land. The original barn gates were scheduled to be restored with proper approval. The wildlife officials also recommended adjustments that would respect both the agricultural property and the surrounding environment. As the work began, I walked along the edge of my land and looked at the area where everything started. A missing gate had revealed much more than a property dispute. It had revealed how easily assumptions could replace facts when nobody questioned them. Then Benjamin called me with one final update. The county had completed its review of the original development records, and they discovered something that even the HOA did not expect. Years before Victoria became president, the developer had created a permanent agreement protecting the relationship between the farm and the community. But one section of that agreement had been overlooked for years. It contained a requirement that every future HOA board member receive a copy during their first year of service. The records showed Victoria had received that document when she joined the board. The question was no longer whether she knew about the rules. The question was why she chose to ignore them. The discovery that Victoria Reynolds had received the agreement years earlier changed the way I viewed the entire situation. Until that moment, there was still a possibility that the HOA had simply misunderstood its authority. But the records showed something different. The information was available. The rules were written clearly. The boundaries were documented. The problem was that the people responsible for following those rules chose to move forward without considering the consequences. Benjamin Foster and I reviewed the final county findings before they were released publicly. The report explained that the HOA had exceeded its authority by removing structures located on private property without proper approval. It also confirmed that the original development agreement protected the relationship between the neighborhood and the existing agricultural land. The farm was not an obstacle to the community. It was part of the community's history from the beginning. The county also addressed the wildlife issue. Officials explained that the bison movement was not caused by negligence from my farm. The situation developed because changes were made to the existing landscape without a complete review of how those changes could affect the surrounding area. The gates had served a purpose beyond appearance. They were part of a system that helped manage movement between different areas of the property. Once they were removed, the environment responded in ways the HOA never anticipated. As the final announcement approached, the golf championship became a very different event than Victoria had planned. Instead of being remembered only as a celebration of the neighborhood, it became the moment when residents learned the full story behind the decisions made by their board. The HOA updated its presentation materials and corrected previous information shared with residents. The community event continued, but the message was different. It was no longer about creating a perfect image. It was about acknowledging the reality of the area and respecting the properties that existed before the neighborhood was built. I noticed something interesting during that week. Many residents who had originally supported the HOA's actions changed their opinion after seeing the documents. They were not against the farm. They were against being left without the complete truth. Several homeowners visited me and apologized for assuming the HOA had handled everything properly. I told them I understood because trust in a community organization is built on the belief that leaders will follow the rules. The final step was restoring the barn gates. The work was completed with proper documentation and approval from the appropriate officials. When the new gates were installed, they looked almost identical to the ones that had been removed. But to me, they represented something much bigger. They represented the importance of protecting property rights through facts instead of arguments. A few days later, Benjamin called me with one final update. The county had completed its review of the HOA procedures and found that the organization needed significant changes in how it handled decisions involving private property. Victoria had agreed to step back from several responsibilities while the board reviewed its leadership practices. But Benjamin had one more piece of information that surprised me. During the final document review, the county discovered an old letter from the original developer addressed to future HOA leaders. The letter contained a warning that had been written decades earlier. It explained that the neighborhood would always exist beside a working farm, and any attempt to change that relationship would create unnecessary conflict. The HOA had been warned from the very beginning. They just chose not to listen until the consequences became impossible to ignore. The day the barn gates were restored was the day I realized the entire situation had never really been about a gate. It had been about whether people would respect the truth when that truth was inconvenient. When I looked at the repaired entrance to my property, I saw more than a structure made of wood and metal. I saw the result of months of questions, documents, and decisions that finally brought everything back to where it belonged. The county had completed its review, the HOA had updated its procedures, and the community finally understood the history of the land. My farm had existed long before the golf course, the neighborhood streets, and the community association. The records had always shown that. The problem was that some people believed a newer development gave them the power to rewrite an older story. After the final announcement, Victoria Reynolds remained involved in the HOA transition process, but her role changed. The board created new requirements for any future decisions involving property boundaries, neighboring land, and community projects. No changes could move forward without proper documentation and review. The same organization that once acted quickly without asking questions now had a process designed to make sure every question was answered first. The residents also changed their perspective. Many of them told me they had originally seen the farm as something separate from their community. After learning the history, they began to see it differently. The farm was not something that appeared after the neighborhood. It was part of the reason the area looked the way it did. The open land, the natural views, and the character of the community were connected to the property that had been there all along. The annual golf championship eventually took place, but it became a different kind of event. Instead of hiding the surrounding properties, the updated community information acknowledged the history of the area. Visitors learned that the neighborhood existed beside a working farm and that both could continue peacefully together. The Bison situation also became a lesson for everyone involved. Wildlife officials continued monitoring the area, and the proper barriers were maintained. The focus shifted from blaming someone to understanding how changes to land can create unexpected results. Looking back, the most surprising part was not that the HOA made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. The surprising part was how long the mistake continued because nobody stopped to check the original documents. A few weeks later, Benjamin Foster and I sat together reviewing the final paperwork one last time. He reminded me that property disputes are rarely solved by the person who speaks the loudest. They are solved by the person who can prove the facts. That lesson stayed with me. I never wanted a conflict with my neighbors. I never wanted the HOA to fail. I simply wanted my property rights to be respected and the truth to be acknowledged. Today, the barn gates stand exactly where they were meant to be. The farm continues operating as it always has. The golf course continues welcoming visitors. The neighborhood continues growing. The difference is that everyone now understands the boundaries between them. The experience taught me something I will never forget. Rules only matter when people are willing to follow them, and authority only works when it respects the limits placed on it. The HOA thought removing my gates would improve their view. Instead, it revealed everything they were trying not to see.